hope you enjoyed our little murder and mayhem in the mountains last week. This week, we are going to have a look at how I found the stories to put that little piece of Halloween goodness together. So join me as we search through one of my absolute favourite primary source resources, the National Archives database TROVE, and we will look at how I found these stories to put into that video. Now, I first came across these stories while I was doing my master's degree back in 2013. I was making a website that I called Welcome to Katoomba. So I do know what I'm looking for while I'm here. But when I started that research, I looked at I put basically Katoomba and murder into the website. So here we have the website organised in terms of most recent through to most distant. Not finding what I'm looking for this way, so I'm going to put it oldest to newest. Again, still turning up a lot of irrelevant things. So while there are things there, stories there that I would like to look at, not always the most relevant. And so I changed the settings for a third time up here to most relevant, and that actually gave me the story I was looking at right at the top, which is the 1917 California murder of George King by Keith Shaw. And this was, as I said in the previous video, huge story, massive story. Could find so much about this. But you can't always find that. Sometimes you will find one little story and then you have to go hunting. So although this one, there are multiple stories that come up very quickly, I'm still going to talk about how you actually search for stories in the archives, because one of the reasons why this is, for me, such a valuable tool is if you, like me, write literary fiction or historical fiction. I write literary fiction with a historical bent, and I call it histographic metafiction, a la Linda Hutchinson. What you need are stories. The stories are there. You don't need to invent any plots at all. They're there. This is one of the great things about this. But it's a matter of finding it. Now, having found this story, we're going to try some other keywords. We are putting George King's name in. Sometimes this will help throw up extra information if you find the right person to expand the story out there. In this case, George King wasn't so useful, as all we got was King George. Same words, but in the wrong order. So we tried George Henry King, which is the full name of the murdered man, but again, not coming up with all that much. So it takes a while getting used to playing with the archives, working out what your keywords are going to be, because if you can get really great results using keywords or names around and expand your story out, but it takes a bit of time. So we try Keith Shaw. Now, Keith Shaw being our murderer in this case. So we get Keith Shaw, we get Keith Shaw's confession, we get his own words on this, which is quite interesting. He is clearly a deeply disturbed individual, and so that goes without saying, given what he did. And so we see coming up things about his appeal, things about his trial. Very interesting way of finding some information about this person. Again, one of the reasons why I like using the archives, the newspaper archives, is often when people write historical fiction, they feel that they then need to read or talk only about people who are very, very famous, as if only the moneyed people of any community had any worth, had any value. Here we're trying another different variation, another name in the story, and seeing what turns up. But as I was saying, people do there is a certain degree that moneyed people or famous people are those who have value, and that those are the interesting stories. But when you go through the old papers, you find all the little people, if you could put it like that, people who basically their story only appears, their paper trail is they were in the paper. There are lots of these stories, and if you follow that paper trail and you dig around it, you can find these really interesting stories that you can play with. You don't have to be that big wealthy person who stayed up at the Carrington, or who ran for Parliament or whatever, to have an interesting story. So again, we are trying Keith Shaw, and we are having a look. Again, we're getting more unrelated stories coming up from this. So you do have to be judicious about what you work out to put in. So we're taking Keith Shaw off, and we're just going back to Katoomba murder, because that was throwing up our best leads in this case. However, there are other cases where you do search around with other names, and you do come up with some very interesting different sides to the story. So here we have another story. It's a much bigger story here. It expands a lot more on not only the murder, but things around the murder. And actually this one is one where the main story is not the one that we're after. It's actually a small bit, and this one's quite good because it can show you how you can move back a page in the paper. So we go back to page 5 and we get the story that we are looking for. We have to search the page. It can be a little bit frustrating if you are unaware of how this whole process works, but it's, once you get the hang of it, it's quite easy. And the TROVE site has recently updated quite significantly. In fact, it's much easier to navigate now than it was 6 months ago. I think they upgraded it in June. So it really is quite an impressive upgrade that they've done to the site, and has made it much easier to navigate, which you no doubt will have noticed between this video and if you go back to our exploration in the archives number 2, where we look at primary sources. The number 1 is obviously is the Anzac research of the war archive and the war records. So this is the upgraded TROVE. We're going back to, now Keith Shaw mentioned something about a goddess. His goddess prompted him to do this, and so I've put Keith Shaw and goddess in here to try and find a little bit more detail on that. So as you read down, you find that he had several head injuries as a child, and he has been taking chloroform, as like drinking it, addicted to this, and that he has this goddess who speaks to him and tells him what to do. So it becomes this very, very interesting story. It becomes a story that has enormous potential. I use this story not only for the Welcome to Katoomba mock tourist website, I also use this story as a little bit of community or colour gossip in my novel Poisoning the Nest, which is set in Katoomba during the First World War, and the story of the Shaw brothers makes its way in there. So it's a story that I have used quite a bit in my own writing, though, and on the Welcome to Katoomba site there's a very short piece of flash fiction or just micro-fiction about the Shaw brothers murder. What I am looking for now, because I do know it exists, is an actual picture of them. There is one. It takes a little bit of time for me to find that, but there is actually a photograph of the Shaw brothers. So this was a huge case, an absolutely massive, massive case. So there was, it really was very well publicized. I had never heard of this. This was not a local gossip story. When I researched this, I pretty much dug it up out of the archives. My sister worked for a while at the day spa that is in the hotel that used to be the California, and that is where the story of the ghost that lives still up there. And hearing that story, I rather put two and two together and assumed, oh well, now we have a name for that ghost. It's George. It's George King. Poor old George King. So that was quite an interesting thing. There are numerous stories of ghosts up here, and not all of them can be tied to any particular crime. In fact, most of them can't. However, this was one that could. It was actually tied to a murder that happened in the hotel, or what the hotel was once. Some of the papers, you will notice that the hotel is called a boarding house. It wasn't a boarding house. This was one of the fancy hotels in Katoomba. But when you look at papers, obviously these are getting them off the wire, and so stories get a little bit truncated or misinterpreted or rewritten a little bit to fit space. But the fact that this was such a huge, massive story is really something that makes it quite interesting. There are many, many stories. You put whatever you want in terms of the keyword search and you will find a story. So if you are sitting there and you have writer's block and you are wondering, what am I going to write about? How can I write a story? What sort of story am I going to come up with? Well, I can tell you that a good way to find yourself a little bit of inspiration is to go onto Trove, find your local area, an area you know, somewhere that you're very interested in, and put in either a date range or a particular crime. Generally just a date range will work. And see what comes up. You will find that there are stories. Now, this one I had been looking for because here are some actual pictures of George and Lionel Shaw, identical twins, twin brothers. But yes, you will find stories. There is zero excuse now with these resources to have writer's block. Absolutely zero excuse to have writer's block. You will find something to inspire you. And so I hope this has inspired you to start your own research. So I think you have now seen some interesting ways in which we can use stories, especially small stories, stories that are otherwise not really shared, and how we can put those together into a larger story. So I'm glad you came along to have a look at that, and I will see you again. Happy hunting. Bye-bye.